Hi there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I wanted to talk about the creative process, specifically my creative process, but also creative processes. I find for me there's lots of different types of ways that I can go about starting to make a track or working on a particular part of my track. And the way that I wanted to cover this briefly is by talking about 5 mistakes that I've made in my own composing journey. All of these mistakes that I'm going to discuss have one underlying root cause, and that's the idea that I'm using the wrong tool for the job or the wrong process for the job. And really I'd be better off spending my time in a slightly different way, or just tweaking the process or the tool so that it's a little bit more in line with my creative vision. So the first mistake that I often make as a commercial composer working in the modern day is using sample instruments or synths when actually working with a live musician would yield a better result. This actually came up for me this week when I was working on a video game track. I had created the track, the loop that was required for this exploration music in a kind of fantasy, spacey world, and it was working fine. I'd tested the loop in game, I'd got positive feedback from the client, but I guess to me, I recognized at some level there was still a little bit of time left to play with, and there was some budget available. I just felt like it would be really valuable to replace the live part that was actually a bass flute sample. I was using the Swam bass flute and my breath controller to give a fairly convincing performance, but I just knew that that would be better if it was played live, and especially because it was a really juicy melody. It was right down at the bottom of the register, and I decided to work with my friend Chris, who's an amazing multi-instrumentalist, woodwind player, and not only was he able to replace that part for me, but he was also able to do multiple takes with little inflections, little options in terms of how to do the vibrato. And then also this whole other part kind of came out of the recording session, which was just a pass that he did of long tones and sustains and flutters and little rhythmic breathy pulses that ended up being quite a core part of the textural backdrop of the track. So for me, the lesson that I was relearning there was that I could have stayed in my familiar, cozy creative process of just doing everything myself, with self-recorded instruments and my samples, staying in the computer and kind of staying in my own head. But in this instance, I opted to extend my creative process to include working with another musician who has their own ideas and their own expertise, and inviting that into the creative process as well. The second mistake I want to discuss is using the wrong MIDI controller setup for the job. This is very much dependent on the particular instrument that I'm working on. So if I'm trying to make a virtual violin performance, there's going to be a particular process that will lend itself to that, versus if I'm trying to craft a synth pad performance. But the overall message is trying to make sure that the way that I'm engaging with the sound, especially in real time, is really optimized to the sound that I have in my head that I'm trying to create. The way that I started out, which is probably similar for many composers starting out, is just with a basic MIDI keyboard, and probably the mod wheel would be mapped to something by default, and that was it. And then any other processing or shifting, shaping of the sound would have to happen in post-production using a lot of clicking. And the more I've been working with virtual instruments, the more I've really found that there's a lot of value in setting up the controls, the physical, tactile controls and ways of performing each virtual instrument in a way that is really helping me to scope in on the sound that I want. And often that means giving me more ways of manipulating the sound in real time, because I'm an improviser. I prefer to be able to shape things in real time like I would with a real instrument. So some of the ways that I do this nowadays are through things like my breath controller, through ways of using my knobs and faders on my keyboard, which just take a little bit of time to set up, but then once they're set up, you can kind of use them every time. And then also other slightly more outlandish techniques. I did a video previously on this channel which demonstrates a way of using 2 MIDI keyboards at once. So this is particularly the case in styles like bluegrass. Here's my drone note. I'm just going to keep my left hand repeating a G, which is a really great way of playing certain kinds of patterns and certain kinds of virtual instruments, especially mallet instruments, where there's inevitably a lot of repeated notes, and that can be quite hard to execute on a regular MIDI keyboard. Another thing that's absolutely crucial when it comes to working with virtual instruments and making sure that you're getting as much as you can out of the virtual instrument is making sure that the velocity response of your keyboard is set appropriately to the plugin that you're using, to the virtual instrument. And this is something that is going to vary from instrument to instrument, and also depending on the musical context. For example, it might be very important to you to have a lot of nuanced control as you're playing, but all within a softer dynamic. And that can be very hard to do if your keyboard is set up in a way which makes it very easy to play loud notes. So there's actually a specific tool that I want to just shout out in this video. It's a free tool. It's called the MIDI Velocity Curve Generator. It's just a simple script that you can use in combination with Logic Pro's scripter. You just copy-paste the code into the Logic Pro scripter, and that will, on a track level, change the velocity response of your keyboard, and that will allow you to scope into the dynamic area that you want to have the most control over. The third mistake that I'd often find myself making is getting lost in plugins and processes when trying to create a very particular abstract sound. So, for example, in transitions, I quite often like to have some kind of riser, and I know in my head that maybe it has to have like a metallic sound, maybe I want it to ping pong around the ears, maybe I want it to sound like it's been reversed, and maybe I want some high frequencies to kind of come in towards the end. I find, especially with abstract sounds that often require a series of quite technical or just quite long, clicky sort of processes, as I say, it's easy to get distracted, easy to get thrown off topic, and whatever you can do to sort of make that bit of the creative process go faster, I think is a good thing. Resisting the urge to just go, oh, what if I click this and what if I click that? But maybe using simpler plugins, simpler processes, and being really intentional about that can sometimes be a good way to go. The fourth mistake that I often make can be applied to either samples or live instruments, and that is not going beyond the default sound. So when I'm writing a piece of music or arranging a piece of music, there's usually something about my choice that is at the core of why I've chosen it. For example, if I've decided to put in a little harp pattern that's playing an arpeggio, maybe the thing that I like about it is that it's quite pingy and it pokes through the music really nicely, and it's more about those individual points of sound rather than the sustain. In that scenario, anything I can do to make that more pingy and less sustained is good, because it really helps me just focus the track, rather than having like that sound but then it bringing with it a load of other stuff that I don't want that might blur the intention of the track. So if I'm working with a sample instrument, that might simply be a case of reducing the decay on each note if that's possible. It might be about processing it in a certain way, for example using a transient designer to bring out the attacks of the notes. Or if I'm working with a live player, I might ask them to play it just in a slightly more pingy way, knowing that I could bring the overall volume of the track down so it still sits nicely in the mix, but the ratio of attack to sustain will be more in my favor in terms of trying to create the effect that I want and the intention that I want. Conversely, if I like the sustain of the sound, I might be tempted to use an attack control, if there is one, on the virtual instrument, or again just discuss with the player, how can I best achieve this sound? I don't want it to poke out, I want it to really blend, so how can we achieve that? I think those kinds of moments where you're not just going, okay, harp sound, okay, sketch that in, not onto the next one, but having a beat where you're just trying to really scope into what it is about that sound that you really like that's leading you forward. For me, I often do this at the point that I'm adding the track into my mix, but this might be something that happens later on in the creative process when you're going back over everything that you've done in the first pass and you're trying to just refine things. And finally, the fifth mistake would be using a computer or a DAW when it's not necessarily the best way to nurture my idea. By this I mean, it might be that the entire track would be better off if I worked on it, developed it, and went really deep into it away from the computer, just in general. and then created a score and then gave it to a musician, and then maybe when I'm mixing it, that's when the computer comes in. But it could also be about, doing some prep work before I then go into a DAW to start sketching and playing with the arrangement. For me personally, this is often the case when I'm working on a slightly chunkier project, like a video game score, where I know that I want to have certain very strong themes, and I want various themes to be connected to one another, and I want there to be just a bit of a musical language, a musical vocabulary that's being established, and I'm sort of planning in advance the big picture, if you like. I'm trying to stay at the high level, and in that kind of scenario, rushing into the DAW and writing tracks can actually be a bit of a mistake. Often what is needed is either for me to sit at a piano and kind of just noodle around, or even before that stage, it might be that I need to play the game, read up on documentation, look at loads of concept art, just sit there and think, have a cup of tea. Text notes are actually something that I find very helpful in general, especially when I'm trying to understand what am I writing the music about here, if it's a film or if it's a game. What are the key themes? What does this remind me of? What images and ideas come to mind? Things that are more personal. It's almost more like a kind of journaling sort of a process. All those kinds of things which are part of the composing process, the creative process, that can very easily get neglected in a drive to just get things done. Of course, there are going to be times when using technology right from the very start is appropriate, especially if it's more in an exploratory mode, like in sound design or playing around with a sample instrument, a synth. You want to get inspired at that early stage in the process, and playing around using technology can be the way to get you there. So there we have it. 5 mistakes that I've made, and the thing tying them all together being this idea of using the right tools for the job, recognizing that there are a variety of creative processes that you could employ, and I guess just daring to ask that question at the start, or maybe during, what is the best way to approach this, rather than just defaulting to your cozy way of working that you're most comfortable in necessarily. I just find there are so many exciting ways of approaching making music, whether it's, kicking off an idea by fiddling around on a synth, or going out and making field recordings, or just sitting and writing in my notebook, doing doodles, talking to musicians, all that good stuff. And knowing when I should be doing what feels like an important question for me to ask myself as a composer in the modern day with all of these kinds of options. So hopefully some of that resonated with you. Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, happy composing.